I have a story about this song. A friend of mine was telling me the other day. I said I was thinking of singing this song. And he said, I was walking down Hotel Street once and went into Smith's Bar. Now, whenever I go by Smith's Bar, I've asked friends, oh, is that a karaoke bar? And they're like, yeah. And another time I'll walk by and see some shenanigans outside and I'll say, is that a gay bar? And they're like, yeah, kinda. Is that a sale? Every kind of bar it is, whatever you can think of, seems Smith's is. And Jerry Santos, the amazingly gifted composer of that song we just heard, was playing there, just happened to be playing. And my friend was there and he told the story about this song that for years, Jerry Santos had waited for a piece of Hawaiian homeland. And like so many of his friends and family, he thought it would be in Waimanalo, which is where so many pieces of Hawaiian homeland have been established. And when it came time, he got a piece of land in Kahalu. So that's not where any of his other friends were or things like that, but it was what happened and where he was. And so he sort of thought he'd write a song about Waimanalo, but it ended up being a song about Kahalu because of that experience. But it's a song that so many people really look at as one of the masterpieces of that golden age of Hawaiian music. And Hawaiian music takes so many forms. Dennis played the Harry Owens tune, Hawaiian Moon. What is the Dreamy Hawaiian Moon? And even Dennis was telling me before how funny it was that for so long, so much of the world thought that was Hawaiian music, that's what Hawaiian music sounded like. It wasn't until much later when some people in Europe really got interested in slap key guitar that the true nature and the beauty of real Hawaiian music came out. And Harry Owens knew that. For those of you who don't know, the composer of Dreamy Hawaiian Moon was the head of the band at the Royal Hawaiian when it was built on Waikiki Beach in 1925. There were a few resorts built there on Waikiki around the turn of the century. The Matson shipping line actually was finding a lot of money and success in steamboat passage from the continent to Hawaii around 1900, 1901. So a group built these first hotels, these resorts really, on the beach in Waikiki. That was how it began, this luxury steam travel. And actually the Royal Hawaiian was sort of the first of the next generation after they took down one of those first constructions. And the architects were actually inspired by Rudolph Valentino's movies at the time. It was built in 1925, but the beauty of Valentino and also the Spanish influence and the Moorish influence in architecture. So it was meant to be a fantasy. And even the song itself, as Dennis was explaining to me, was a fantasy as far as actual Hawaiian music is concerned. But one of the things that Harry Owens did was he had a separate band actually at the Royal Hawaiian. There were really two bands. There was the regular sort of European band, if you will, and then he had a separate sort of Hawaiian group that would play more authentic Hawaiian music there at the Royal Hawaiian. And so he was one of the first people to really try to cultivate and keep some of the Hawaiian culture that he found when he arrived as a musician. Of course, I mean, Wailea Country Club was actually part of the Royal Hawaiian. There was an off-site golf course. There's no doubt it was the place of power, and particularly power of white people there in the Pacific, as we do the real analysis of what that place was. And then also it was Duke Kahanamoku's hangout. He and the Beach Boys hung out, meaning his Beach Boys, the original, the Beach Boys, not the musical group. And he liked it there. So it's one of those pieces of Hawaiian history that we like so much of history, that there are many sides to. And in 1987, a year after his death, actually, Harry Owens received a Lifetime Achievement Award, a Nahoku Hono Hono, Nahoku Hono Hono. What's that? Hanu Hanu. I'm sorry. And I actually have that written, and which is really like a Hawaiian Grammy here. So this transition, this idea of fantasy is something that is in stark contrast with our reading today from Hanani K. Trask. I know that many people are familiar with Professor Trask, with Dr. Trask. She died in July of 2021. She founded the Hawaiian Studies Department here at UH Manoa, was its director for 10 years, and then really was in an emeritus capacity taught still Hawaiian studies, mentored two generations, I think really, of two separate generations of new academics and new researchers into Hawaiian studies. Really a hugely influential voice and force of nature in these lands. And I think, though, she's best known as an activist, right? She wrote 2 books of poetry, and we read one of the poems today. Thank you, Marie. A fierce proponent of Hawaiian sovereignty and a fierce protector of the Hawaiian people, also opposed to any kind of tourism at all. So one of the things we see here with her, as I was reading one of her stories about her, was that student from Louisiana who accused her of being racist against white people. And her response, long before so many of us started talking about white supremacy culture and the belief in and listening to and lifting up the voices of others outside of that white centrality, simply said to her colleagues and to that student that she's not backing down. She didn't think it was appropriate for him to be there and that he really should just go home, is what she said. And he did go home. The stories like this of Professor Trask abound. And this reading, I Will Go, it also talks about the whole part of the discussion, the whole poem is possessive and sharing. It all says our, O-U-R, our shared land, our shared place, this place that is shared, that is everyone's, is in a sense what she is saying. The whole poem is really a genealogy of place. And place, in a sense, is a person in that poem. It's the subject. And that genealogy of place is so important in her work, so important actually in all of our lives, and we may not even fully know it. The closing of that poem, into our sovereign sons, S-U-N-S, drunk on the mana of Hawaii. Even in our opening discussion here before worship began, Mary McKay so beautifully said, so many people come here and find the other part of their heart. They find what was missing. I know for me, so much of it, the thing I've said before is I never understood faith rooted in nature-based gods until I arrived here. If I had grown up here, that sense of worshipfulness of the space around us might not have fully settled in. But being here, being in this space, that kind of faith makes sense to me more than ever before in my life. And so this past week, the 17th, we remembered once again the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. It was Monday, and following the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani and her reign, she was imprisoned in Iolani Palace, imprisoned in her own home. And one of the things she did when she was there, among many, was to write. We always celebrate on the Queen's birthday the vastness of her gifts, both that were endowed to her, both of thought and artistry and bravery and courage, but also the gifts she has bestowed on the world, one of the great gifts of which is her English translation of the Kumulipo, which is the Hawaiian creation chant. It is 2,101 lines, I believe, which is an important number in the faith. And traditionally, kahu recite it only during the time of the makahiki. And I bring this up only during this time because we are in the time of the makahiki right now. And this is, as a matter of fact, this is also the only time when we really discuss the approach and the presence of the god Lono in the Hawaiian faith is during the time of the makahiki. The full name of Lono, which we sort of commonly call Lono, is actually Lono Ika Makahiki. And so it truly means this is the time of Lono here in the makahiki. The first 12 lines from the Queen's translation are these. At the time that turned the heat of the earth, at the time when the heavens turned and changed, at the time when the light of the sun was subdued to cause light to break forth, at the time of the night of Makali'i, which means winter, then began the slime which established the earth, the source of deepest darkness, of the depth of darkness, the source of night, of the depth of night, of the depth of darkness of the sun in the depth of the night. Night is come, born is night. So beautiful. The Kumulipo is broken up into 16 parts, or va, that talk about the adventures of so much, the life of this island, the genealogy of these lands. And the 15th section talks about the adventures of Maui in particular. And then the 16th chapter, the 16th book, describes the lineage of Maui and the lineage to the Pi'ilani who united Maui in the latter part of the 16th century. And as it turns out, Hanani K. Trask was a descendant of Pilani, of that Pilani line in Maui, tracing that lineage back to Maui. Many people who look at the Kumulipo marvel at what it did almost, I guess it would be 4 or 5 decades before Darwin had a chance to do it. Talked about the movement, the creation of the ways that human forms came from forms in the sea. It was a theory, it was something that in Europe was a theory, it was something that had been part of Hawaiian sacred tradition for centuries. So this forethought, this insight, this truth, this knowledge laid out in here also talks about the turning heat of the earth in the first line before we ever knew there was a molten core at the center of the planet. It goes on and on, the wisdom and the beauty of the Kumulipo. It brings to mind all of these pieces together. In Harry Owen's tune, we heard what vacationers to these lands first heard. And then in Trask's life, and the world we see, and this word we see, this freedom she imagined, means sovereignty and fundamental changes to life here. If she had her way, if she had her dream, there'd be a huge change in these lands. So it raises that question of what's the boundary of freedom? When does my freedom start making somebody else less free? What's that boundary? And is that still freedom? If what I need to be free is making someone else less free. When have you felt the most free in your life? Really think about it. And what would you give to always feel that free. Free might mean not having anything to do for you. Could mean a lot of things. In the Harry Owens tune, I think that idea of freedom is being able to do whatever you want. And I think some of the criticisms of tourism in these lands comes from a long history of people coming here and thinking they can do whatever they want. It also means an absence of unjust or unqualified authority, an end to enslavement or imprisonment or even occupation. And this definition of freedom is much more like Trask's poem, this idea, or Trask's life or her thinking. To be clear, I'm talking more or less about the freedom of a person, of a physical form. There are things like academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and all kinds of other freedoms that can get parceled out into various parts of our lives. But we're really talking about the form, the human form and freedom. And at times, so that we can sound the alarm of these slightest infringements of one of those little cherished freedoms I get, but we're still just coming back to the human freedom, the freedom to choose, the freedom to seek. Just this week, the failure to change the filibuster rules in the Senate has raised a very important question of whether there will truly be free and fair elections in the coming years. You know, I sang Jerry Santos's masterpiece for you. I hope I did it justice. It's about leaving and coming back to this land that he saw changing. I fear you won't be as I left you. In the opening verse, he talks about catching o'opu in a mountain stream. Do you know what o'opu are, really? It's a food fish, sometimes used in Hawaiian religious practices, though such use was restricted and controlled by kapu for a time. It was a very important fish. The o'opu is a wonder. It's born in mountain streams, and then it is washed out to sea as a child, where it lives in the ocean for a while and grows and matures and eats and feeds. It's a carnivorous fish. And when it's ready to reproduce, it returns to the rivers and the streams to live out its adult life. It literally swims upstream. They've actually been known to climb waterfalls as high as 1,000 feet in the air. This fish has no hands and no legs. It's a wonder. Don't go chasing waterfalls, I guess, unless you're in O'opu. That's for the 90s. I'm always an 80s boy, but it's a 90s reference. I like the sacred animal of this song. And like this sacred animal, so many of our relationships with the land here are relationships that are characterized by leaving and returning and leaving and returning, going and coming back again. So many who step foot on these islands do so for a short period of time, whether by necessity or just by choice, by vacation. But virtually everyone who comes and goes from these lands is in search of a kind of freedom. It might be the escape in the Harry Owens song, Personal Freedom. It might be the work or for work on behalf of the military, defending freedom perhaps in some way. It might be some other kind of freedom, and the life and dedication of Trask and those who hold many of her beliefs, because make no mistake about it, part of Trask's appeal and popularity was that she said some of the things in public that others held in their hearts, for sure. But her life and dedication were focused on freeing the Kanaka Maoli people from the unjust rule that she saw and degradation of the land that she felt, in her view, is not just part of life, that is life for her. Is freedom really freedom when it requires the imprisonment of another? I think the Queen, imprisoned in her own home, might have a comment on that. I read her translation of the creation chant, the Kumulipo, and I marvel at the relation of all life to all the rest of life, which is a truth told in so many sacred texts across time. I think of the arrival of the steamships at the turn of the century and the dream of freedom for so many visitors that in many ways turned into a nightmare for these lands and for the people of these lands. And I hear the powerful voice of Dr. Trask, who called and called for the freedom of autonomous rule, freedom from the arrival of tourists in these lands, freedom for her people. See, the voices of history are calling out for a freedom that recognizes the truth and builds a new way. The voices of many people are calling out for a freedom that makes right a grievous wrong and builds a new way. The voices of the Aina, the whisper of the lands that still remains, are calling out for the freedom that will help it survive and thrive in partnership and not in subjugation, for a new way. And you better believe this new way will not be easy. It might feel like we're lost at sea at times, longing for home, like we are swimming upstream against the cool mountain current, like at times we are climbing a waterfall with no hands and no feet. But building a new way to be in relationship with these lands, building a new way to understand the needs of its people, and building a new way to a new future from this history, that is the call. That is the cause. And that is, my friends, the cost of freedom. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.